The NCAA tournament is often a time when the best players in college basketball have a chance to elevate their game to new levels before the upcoming draft. But as you might have noticed, one of the biggest names in college basketball has been absent from his team the second half of this year, specifically talking about the Oregon Ducks player Bol Bol. What's up everybody, welcome back. For those new, my name's Brian and I'm a doctor and a sports fan, and it's my goal here to combine those interests to look at sports medicine and sports injuries topics to help teach you a little bit more about what's going on. Perfect opportunity here to hit on a new injury that we haven't talked about before in one of the biggest names in college basketball leading into the upcoming NBA draft. Specifically, today we're going to review the navicular bone stress fracture suffered by Bol Bol. As always, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more of these videos, and let's get started. Now, if you know your basketball history, both old and recent, you'll know that Bol is not the only player to have had an injury like this. During the 1985 season, even Michael Jordan had an injury like this that kept him out of the majority of that year. Yao Ming, of course, another big guy, tall, lots of body weight, suffered a fracture to this in 2009 during the playoffs and then missed the upcoming season, and then ultimately had his career ended because of repetitive foot injuries. And most recently, 76ers player Joel Embiid missed his first couple of seasons in the NBA because of a navicular fracture in his foot. Now, of course, in his case, we know that he turned things around, got back to playing, and is now one of the best players in the game, but this is still a risk going forward. There's a common trend with these types of injuries. It's usually big men, typically centers, people who have heavier body weight that are subjecting their feet to higher and higher loads. Let's take a look at the important bones involved in our foot. Our tibia and our fibula form the lower part of our limb and come down to form the top part of the ankle joint. In the foot itself, we then have the talus, we have the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. There's the tarsal bones, including the navicular, the cuboid, and the cuneiform bones. And then we have the metatarsals, which are the long bones of the foot, and then the phalanges of the foot. The navicular bone sits on the medial portion of the foot, or the inside of the foot, and you can actually palpate the navicular tubercle on yourself if you reach down and feel for that bump just in front of your inside heel bone. One of the unique features of the navicular bone is how it's biomechanically involved in the function of our foot, and that's part of what makes it so susceptible to injuries, as we'll talk about later on. It has a lot of articulating surfaces, meaning it's involved in a lot of different joints and connections with other bones in the foot, so this bone bears a lot of load through our foot, particularly in an athlete such as a basketball player or a runner who's doing a lot of jumping, cutting, and sprinting. Another part of the anatomy to know about for the navicular bone is one of the muscle insertions. So specifically, the posterior tibialis tendon wraps around and inserts on the bottom side of the navicular bone, and that's a muscle that's involved with inversion, or pointing our foot inward. There's a number of different fractures that we can have to this bone. You can have an avulsion fracture where that tendon actually rips a piece of the bone off. You can have a sudden acute just compression fracture to the body of the bone. But the thing we're going to talk about today is a stress fracture to this bone. In general, stress fractures are the result of more chronic, repetitive load that builds up over time, as opposed to a sudden single event. They're really hard to pick up on imaging, and most of the time with a regular x-ray you won't see it, and so you need to do more in-depth things like an MRI or a CT scan. We can classify stress fractures of this bone based on 3 different types, and type 1 is the least severe. So in a type 1 stress fracture, only the top outer surface of the bone, called the cortex, is actually involved. In a type 2 stress fracture that extends down through that outer layer of bone into the body of the bone, and then in a type 3, it goes all the way through and extends down to the layer on the bottom side of the bone. There's 2 specific features about the navicular bone that make it particularly susceptible to stress fractures and difficulty with healing. And those involve blood supply and the biomechanical loading of the bone. Just like our muscles, just like our cells in the body, our bones need blood to function, to get nutrients, to get oxygen. And so it's important to think about the blood supply to all the bones when it comes to healing. Because there's so many articulating surfaces of the navicular bone, it's hard to get blood to the whole area of the bone. In particular, you have blood supply from the top coming from an artery called your dorsalis pedis. That's the pulse that you can feel on top of your foot. And then you have blood supply coming from the bottom in one of the plantar arteries. The tricky part is there's no real good blood supply to the middle portion of that bone. In the case of a stress fracture, if you have some sort of focal injury in the bone, your body needs to deliver oxygen, nutrients, all the necessary things to promote healing. But if you don't have good blood supply, then it makes it harder to heal. The second thing that makes the navicular bone susceptible is just the biomechanical load that it sustains. Whenever we jump and land and plant our foot, all of that force from our body has to get transferred through our foot and then up the body. As I mentioned in the beginning, the navicular bone forms the keystone of that arch on the inside of our foot, And so it's the main bone that's shouldering a lot of that compressive load in the foot. Of course, the heavier a person is, the more weight they're putting through their feet. And so that's why we see a lot of these injuries in bigger, heavier athletes like centers. You're bigger, you have more force behind you, and so the more that you're pounding that bone and squeezing that bone, the more susceptible you make it to injury. So if we've got a fracture, then what do we do to fix it? Well, in the case of Bol, it sounded like they tried some conservative therapy at first, but then honestly pretty quickly jumped to an actual surgery. There's a lot of conflicting research out there about how to best treat these injuries, and that means that there's no real 100% consensus on what the data shows is the right thing to do. If you go the conservative route, then you're putting someone in a solid cast and you're taking all the weight off of their foot for usually somewhere around 6 to 8 weeks, and then you reassess how it's healing. In the case of a surgery, they can go in, they're usually doing some sort of pinning or putting a screw, and sometimes they'll even do some bone grafting to help increase those healing properties of the bone. But there's this persistent question of what's better, surgery or no surgery? The tricky part of these injuries is if you don't heal them properly, they can cause tons of problems down the road, and it's really hard for people to be completely accurate and on top of things if they're not doing surgery and they're just told to keep all their weight off of it. In 2010, there was a study that was released in a pretty prominent journal looking at a review of a lot of different smaller studies trying to answer this question of what's better, surgery or no surgery. At that time, they found that there was absolutely no difference between the healing time, the time to get back to activities, and so they recommended that surgery was not the preferred option in this case. However, they also recognized that a lot of the recent trend was moving towards doing surgery, especially in elite athletes. Now, a more recent study came out in 2014 that sort of changed the way that we think about this. That study suggested that if you do a surgery, there's a quicker time to get back to activity. And it's a pretty big difference, roughly 16 weeks for people who had surgery and about 21 weeks for people who didn't, so more than a full month of playing time. In the case of Bol, it sounded like he had a very short period of conservative treatment, but then whenever they sat and looked at the timeline, they probably looked at some data like this and felt that doing the surgery was ultimately going to get him back on the court sooner. And of course, time matters with the upcoming NBA draft and the combines and so on. Now, how long should we expect him to be out, and do we think he could be back in time for the NBA combine and the NBA draft? Whenever they do a surgery, they always want to confirm with imaging that the fracture is healing, and so they'll do some sort of CT scan or MRI after the surgery, usually around the 10-week mark, before determining whether or not he can start playing again. From previous research, usually 10 weeks is about the earliest that this can happen, but most of the time it's longer and closer to around 5 months before someone is back playing at their previous potential. So if we assume he had the surgery beginning of January, end of last year, then 10 weeks would put him at about the middle of March, and then thinking more realistically in terms of closer to 5 months, that puts him closer into like April, May. But still in time before the NBA draft, and so I'm sure they're hoping that he can get back from this procedure and be able to go to some of the camps and do some of the workouts before the draft time. So hopefully the timeline works out well where he can recover from this and then get back to playing before the draft. Now, what does this mean going forward? Certainly anytime a player like this has an injury such as a stress fracture, it causes people to be more concerned about how their body is carrying all this different load. It's going to be really important that they address all of his movement and biomechanics to try to offload and properly distribute stress through his feet as best as possible. But that's it for this video, everybody. Hopefully that was helpful to get some more insight into the navicular stress fracture suffered by Bol Bol. I hope you guys learned something. As always, let me know any comments or questions you have below. Enjoy watching basketball this spring as we see these teams go through the tournament. And until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you later. Bye.